Welcome to the EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The module is Social Exclusion, Part Yet Apart. The objectives of this module are to understand the concept of social exclusion and to see it in practice through a case in India. This module was written by Dr. Umakant, an independent research scholar in New Delhi. I am Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University of Rome. The concept of social exclusion is a very broad one in its essence and in the coverage, the way that it's applied. It covers a wide variety of themes that have been the focus of various disciplines within the social sciences, so it's a cross and interdisciplinary concept. In general, the idea is that there are a number of exclusive practices that discriminates against certain kinds of people in society, through the economy, and in the public body at large. So this concept of social exclusion is then met with policies that attempt to rectify it through inclusion. So social exclusion is a phenomenon in the social sciences, and social inclusion is a policy of government to attempt to rectify several of these phenomena that are observed by the social sciences. Now, there are numerous grounds on which an individual or a group of people are forced to lead a life of marginality or exclusion. These grounds differ. They can be caste, origin, race, class, religion, gender, disability, and any number of other factors. Now, given that there are so many factors that are brought into account under this concept of social exclusion, there's also a number of different applications of what is meant by exclusion. There are extreme forms, there are moderate forms, there are forms that can be remedied, and there are forms that have existed for centuries. The caste system in India typifies a process of social exclusion that has served to marginalize the outcasts of this system for millennia. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the caste system represents a system of graded inequality. It presents a hierarchical social order that grants privileges and immunities to the higher castes and forces exclusion and indignities upon those who are excluded from that system, namely the Dalits. Now, we've talked about social exclusion in this as a vague umbrella concept. We should realize that since the 1970s, the term has been thrown around in various disciplines of the social sciences. You'll see it in especially activist-oriented political theory. You find it in sociology, you see it in economics, and in some respects there are traces of classical philosophy that mention this, which referred to as otherness or othering. In the recent past, since around the year 2000, when Amartya Sen published a paper for the Asian Development Bank on social exclusion, it became apparent that this was a concept that needed more rigorous understanding, more rigorous study, and more precise conceptual foundation. Amartya Sen argued in the year 2000 that the concept of social exclusion is seen as covering a remarkably wide range of social and economic problems. Now, while he gave credence to the functional use of the concept of social exclusion, he did lay some doubts about how much traction we can get out of an umbrella concept like this, and demanded that we need to clarify exactly what we mean by it, how it can be used, in order that remedies for it can actually be implemented. But this is not a concept peculiar to the Indian social sciences by any means. In fact, the French have been working on it for several years, since the time of the Algerian War and the troubles in the 60s in France. The concept of social exclusion has been quite dominant within the understanding of the social sciences. So much so that the government has already taken up the concept as crucial to understanding the policies that it needs to take in certain of its ministries. There is a ministry that is referred to as a Ministry for Social Action, and the Secretary of State for that ministry, whose name is René Lenoir, had argued that almost 10% of the French population can be considered excluded, socially excluded in some form or another. He mentioned which populations he was referring to: the mentally and physically handicapped, suicidal people, aged, invalid, abused children, substance abusers, delinquents, single parents without means of support, multi-problem households, marginal and asocial persons, so people who refuse to be included for whatever reasons, and other what he called social misfits. And we can see there that in the use of the term social exclusion in French policy, we already have an umbrella concept that would, in principle, make it impossible to treat the problem of social inclusion with any singular method. After all, you're talking about people, on the one hand, who don't want to be included. For example, studies have shown that a number of homeless people, of course, a large majority of homeless people are looking for homes and shelters, but there are a number of homeless people, it's speculated as many as 15%, who don't even want to not live homeless. And this poses a problem that is somewhat intractable, and it poses a deep conceptual problem for the idea of social exclusion when we blanket the phenomenon as those who are excluded all want and need to be included. So what we have is a conceptual problem and a political problem. When we attempt to enact legislation to bring the problem into some sort of resolution, we find that we have a conflict of the philosophical sense of the concept, the political demands for doing something about the problem, and legal impossibility for undertaking that sort of exercise. Certain legal and political philosophers have therefore taken up the concept to try to see if they can begin to clarify it. This has happened mostly post-1998, when a very important paper was published, more or less demanding that the concept social exclusion stop being used, and instead each of the individual problems that are umbrellaed within that concept should be separated and dealt with in their own discipline. One of the authors who's very active in publishing on social exclusion is named Hilary Silver. Silver notes that even if we start to dismantle the umbrella concept of social exclusion, there are certain things that we're going to need to keep aware of that shouldn't fall out of people's interests just because these kinds of problems don't have a disciplinary home. Silver lists the following people who have to be always kept in mind when we're trying to solve problems related to social exclusion. People are excluded from livelihood. They're excluded from secure permanent employment. They're excluded from the possibility of earning, of property, of credit, or land. Excluded from the possibility of having access to housing or minimal prevailing consumption levels, educational skills, cultural capital. They're excluded from the boons or benefits of the welfare state, of the rights and entitlements that are supposed to be there for all citizens. Excluded even from the concept of nation, especially when a nation state is composed of a dominant race. Excluded from the idea of family, of humanity, fulfillment and understanding. So what is Hilary Silver adding here in terms of conceptual clarity? On the one hand, she's referring to the ways in which the concept of social exclusion has incorporated exclusion on all kinds of grounds: caste, class, religion, race, gender. By suggesting that all of these inclusions may not have something unifying and contribute to conceptual lack of clarity under the concept of exclusion, she says, then let's shift to the processes of exclusion and the communities out from which people are excluded. Now, this is quite interesting, because when you think about the terms that she uses, for example, to be excluded from the nation, what does something like that mean? A perfect example in Europe, where a lot of the idea of social exclusion arrived, at least in terms of social theory, are the Roma population. So the Roma population don't necessarily consider themselves Hungarian or Romanian or French or what have you. They believe they belong to a distinct ethnicity and culture, and part of that culture demands nomadic, certain sense of movement, not staying put. So it wasn't organized into an agricultural settled community. They started as some sort of nomadic community, and even in the 21st century wish to remain so. So considering that nation states are conceived in terms of territory, territoriality, and the citizens who live within that territory, the very possibility for the concept of a nation state to accommodate a group of people who refuse to be bound to territory already shows that conceptually the idea of nation state cannot accommodate alternative forms of lifestyle to fixed position based on an agricultural heritage. So the Roma are a perfect example of the problem of social exclusion, but a problem that cannot be handled or treated by suggesting that what we need to include the excluded into is in some way prefigured. After all, the Roma don't want to be included into majoritarian mainstream Romanian or Hungarian life. So here we have an added element that Hilary Silver introduces us to in order to help to understand that the conceptual problems that social exclusion face are matched by the impossibility of solving those problems if we don't already problematize the concepts which we wish to use to solve the problem. So we need to problematize the concept of inclusion just as much as we have seen that there are already problems inherent to the concept of exclusion. Now, Hilary Silver has written also about the manner in which the concept of social exclusion evolved in the last 30 years, primarily in European social theory. She writes, social exclusion is usually defined as a dynamic process of progressive, multidimensional rupturing of the social bond at the individual and collective levels. By social bond, I mean the social relations, institutions, and imagined identities of belonging constituting social cohesion, integration, or solidarity. Social exclusion precludes full participation in the normatively prescribed activities of a given society and denies access to information, resources, sociability, recognition, and identity, eroding self-respect and reducing capabilities to achieve personal goals. So Hilary Silver's position is that irrespective of the conceptual lack of clarity over social exclusion, we have certain communities who can definitely be regarded phenomenologically or empirically as excluded. What are we going to do about it? We don't know what the policies would be. We can't assume that the policy should be simply to include or mainstream them. Nevertheless, unless we are participating in the so-called imagined communities of the nation state, we will never be in a position to earn the advantages of the welfare state, of the health system, and so on. So there's a gaping problem for the general idea of governance and the basic principles of political philosophy, posed in some respect by the nature of that which is excluded and the only means or tools that we have conceptually for including those who are excluded. We're left with just a couple of alternatives. Either forced assimilation, which was of course tried on numerous occasions throughout history with Jews, with Roma, or we're left with some sort of demand of a kind of recognition of plurality, and in the process of plurality, managing to find techniques of governance that can funnel resources towards those marginalized communities. Another author who's written extensively on social exclusion is Naila Kabir. Now, she's identified the sort of social practices that result in exclusion, and she created a framework for understanding what social exclusion is in a different way of treating the attack on the concept of social inclusion that I had mentioned came up in 1998. So we've already seen Silver's suggestion in the wake of the attack on the concept of social exclusion. She says, yes, this concept is very broad and covers a great number of people, but it's not a uniquely flawed concept. The very concept of inclusion, mainstream, and normativity is equally flawed. And so there's no point in concentrating on the flaws of exclusion until we concentrate equally on the flaws of inclusion. An alternative approach is offered by Naila Kabir, who says that we can come up with a framework for understanding what does and what does not qualify for exclusion, and the mechanisms by which people, individuals, or communities actually get excluded. She identifies three mechanisms. One is the mobilization of institutional bias. The second is social closure. And the third is unruly practices. In the mobilization of institutional bias, these biases can be either conscious or unconscious. In other words, let's take an academic community, for example. The academic community claims to be interested in educating its students, irrespective of the background, cultural, racial, gender background of the students who wish to be educated. And nevertheless, there are clear cases, I'm sure everybody knows of them, where somebody who is some sort of a social misfit, let's just say, for example, refuses to shower, refuses to follow certain norms that are regarded as socially appropriate, is homeless, for example, in some way doesn't fit the paradigm, irrespective of the institutional claims that the academic institution is there to educate people irrespective of class, caste, gender, and so on. There is going to be a process, unconscious, of the social exclusion of that person who is a social misfit. So here we see an example of unconscious institutional bias. The functioning of the institution relies upon certain norms about which we are not conscious and which are never fully articulated. And yet, if you don't live up to those norms, if you don't satisfy those norms, even though these norms are unstated, and there's generally not a rule book that says every student in this community must have a home and shelter. I mean, there's no such rule. There are certain rules on the kind of behavior that students must adhere to, but there's certainly nothing that says they must have a house. So the norms upon which, the unarticulated norms upon which the social institution, in this case the academic institution, relies are unstated. And in the process, there can be acts of unconscious exclusion. And these exclusions are not performed simply by the professor. They're performed by everybody who's participating in this institution. So students start to move away from this person, say, and that activity is not discouraged by the faculty member or the administration. So mobilization of institutional bias is an interestingly bizarre way in which exclusion happens right under our very noses, not within full sight and not within full awareness of our conscious minds. For social closure, this is the classical case of social exclusion. Social closure suggests that groups should cohere and subscribe to certain rules and regulations. Some people belong, some people don't belong, and the clearest case is for example, transgendered people homosexual people, anyone who doesn't fit into, let's say, the model of heteronormativity or gender specificity. These people face social closure very clearly. They face it not unconsciously, but in fact quite consciously. We might tell ourselves, well, this person this person may be nice, but I'm not sure that I want him or her or he, she around my children. So there's a process of social closure which is quite conscious. Intended effect might be meant simply to preserve the status quo, but the unintended consequences of this process of social closure are very harsh. It further marginalizes members of these communities who don't conform to heteronormativity or gender norms or whatever other kinds of bases we have for exclusion. So nobody necessarily means to be condemning, for example, hijras to a life of marginality and begging when we collect our children and move them away from them. The intended effect is meant to just be in some way self-preservatory, but the unintended consequences are radical circumstances of pushing people onto the margin. Unruly practices is the third mechanism identified by Kabir. And here we can speak of explicit versus informal ways that people get socially excluded. So by unruly practices, what Kabir refers to is that gap between what is stated and what is performed. So in Indian legislation, there are clear prohibitions and strictures against caste prejudice, against untouchability, against other kinds of discrimination based on origins and birth. But what are the practices in the country? As we'll see momentarily, the practices are radically different from what you infer from looking at the legislation. So unruly practices is the institutional mechanism by which, in the face of clear statements of what you shouldn't do, everybody is anyway doing it. So what Kabir has given us then are different ways that social exclusion can come about institutionally, and these can be conscious or unconscious, intended or unintended, explicit or not. So that was a framework through which to clarify the concept of social exclusion in order to rescue it from the critique that was put forward against the concept being too fuzzy and too large to do anything about. Now, we've discussed social exclusion as a concept with a few examples from France and Europe and India. Now, let's see how social exclusion generally plays out in the Indian intellectual and activist community. The primary fixation for the concept of social exclusion in India, the primary fixation is on caste, the core of social exclusion. Now, it's certainly not the only one. We've discussed the transgender community and other people who experience various kinds of institutional and systematic marginalization. But nevertheless, the core of social exclusion is considered to be result from the caste system. Dr. Ambedkar had written many volumes on the nature of the caste system, and he had spoken at great length about how the caste system functions within the Indian village. In Ambedkar's work and writings about the Indian village, he had in mind the glorification of the village that was always there in Gandhi's writings and speeches. So Gandhi had in some way suggested that the Swaraj India after independence won't be a mere repeating of the British system without the British. It won't be the British Raj without the British. It will instead be a system of village India where the sense of sovereignty is removed from some central government like the capital city in Delhi and resituated back into each individual village where anyway at that time in the 40s more than 80% of the Indian population resided. In contrast to that, Dr. Ambedkar said, well, let's look at what really happens in the village. Let's not think about the ideal of the village that Gandhi is talking about. Let's see what's happening in the village to 40% of the Indian population. What Ambedkar pointed out was that the structure of the village is always and almost everywhere throughout the country made with distinctive segregations. So there's always an area of the village where caste Hindus are permitted or where they live, and there's what Dr. Ambedkar referred to as a cordon sanitaire, a kind of line, a purity line, outside of which untouchables were relegated to live. This is an archetypal physical representation of social exclusion. You have a center of activity, culture, political life, which is the village, and then you have some exclusionary point, some limit which shouldn't be crossed, where those who are socially excluded, marginalized, in this case the Dalits, where they are told to live. And the conditions under which they transgress that line are always conditions determined upon the sweet will of the caste Hindus within the center of the village. Now the problem is that this wasn't simply a series of empirically established practices. They were practices that were sanctified through religious scripture. So it's not that we're dealing with an unruly problem, to use Kabir's terms, that people shouldn't treat other people like this, that people shouldn't exclude and marginalize the Dalits, that they should be permitted to enter into the temple, that they should be permitted to draw water from the well that's at the center of the village. There's nothing like that. There were commands to ensure that the Dalit didn't enter the temple. It would make the temple impure. Commands that the Dalit must not draw from the main well. So these are not unruly practices. These are religiously imposed practices that are followed in many cases to the letter throughout villages all over India. So here we have a case of understanding social exclusion very concretely in the Indian context, which is the religiously prescribed social exclusion of the untouchables. We've discussed social exclusion as a concept. We've discussed the problems of ambiguity inherent to the concept, which prevent us from coming up with clear regulations or laws or policies in order to cope with the problem. We've seen two different interpretations of how to clarify it. One is just to problematize all normal theory and say that we're not the ones with the problem. The other is to more systematically understand the mechanisms behind exclusion and to explain how they happen so that clearly policies can be created to start to undo them. And then we looked at the concrete case in India of the caste system, especially the outcasts, as those who are paradigmatically excluded from the social system. Now, narrowing in even further, within this idea of the outcast excluded from social life, we have the case of manual scavenging. Now, manual scavenging is a very disturbing but also interesting case because it fulfills many of the conditions that were laid out in terms of the mechanisms of social exclusion. So on the one hand, we have a clear case of social closure because those who engage in scavenging, more than 95% of them belong to the outcast, untouchable communities. They're primarily Dalits. So the precondition of the religiously sanctioned exclusion of this group of people is then put face to face with legislation prohibiting them from engaging in this practice. So when we're dealing with manual scavenging, we have a clear case where 1,000 years of religiously sanctioned practice comes up against recent legislation. And we move then from the domain of social exclusion into what was referred to as unruly practices. What are these unruly practices? Well, on the one hand, we have legislation simply outlawing the practice of manual scavenging. Now, let's assume that we wish to adhere to this legislation and outlaw the practice of manual scavenging. What then are we to do with this sort of empirical data? According to the National Sample Surveys Office, in 2012, 60% of rural India and almost 9% of urban India have no latrine facility. 60% of rural India has no latrine facility. Around 32% of rural India have access to drainage facilities attached to their dwelling units. So only about a third of the people who live in rural India even have any kind of drainage with which to attend to these issues. Only 30% of rural households in India have access to some sort of garbage disposal. So what happens to the rest of the solid waste that is produced and lying around there in the village? Each year, 1.3 lakh tons of solid waste is generated in cities where municipalities exist in India. And now keep in mind that only 70% of Indian cities are actually covered by municipalities. So the empirical data suggests that the prohibition, the blanket prohibition of manual scavenging is not just impossible, but, and this is the more penetrating insight, it's likely even known that the people who pass such legislation realize that it's not possible. So unruly practices and social exclusion are the order of the day in this problem of manual scavenging, which is the most intensive way of understanding social exclusion in practice in India. Perhaps this is why every effort that government has made through legislation and other administrative initiatives have failed to deliver the desired results. The non-implementation, or the limited implementation, is a bane that everybody recognizes in the country. And nevertheless, since social exclusion in India has taken on a form that is not just hypocritical, it's not going against the ideology that we're taught, it is in fact going in line with an ideology that many of us are taught. The idea of dealing with social exclusion merely within the domains of social science becomes something of a farce. This is a legal and political problem that has to be treated in a multidimensional and concerted way. Thank you.